Ever wonder what keeps America from burning down? It is not executives in Italian suits. It is the invisible workers in windowless basements holding up legal systems nobody else understands. When human resources fired me to save spare change, they had no idea they just pulled the pin on a federal grenade. Grab a black coffee, and let me tell you how one clueless manager burned a $1 billion empire to the ground in under 5 hours. Welcome back to Boss Revenge Stories, and thank you from the bottom of my heart for your continued support. Recently, YouTube disabled monetization on our channel, leaving us completely without an operating budget to keep bringing you these narratives. If you find yourself enjoying today's story, please consider supporting us by joining our Patreon, where you can listen to even more incredible, exclusive true stories featuring multiple emotional voice actors that we simply cannot publish publicly on YouTube. You can join our community right now by scanning the QR code on your screen or by clicking the Patreon link in the video description or the pinned comment. Now, grab your coffee, settle in, and let us dive right into today's absolute disaster, starting with a woman named Natalie Campbell. I was 32 years old and running on fumes, caffeine, and pure spite. For the past 6 years, I worked at OmniVantage Logistics, headquartered in the freezing, snow-bitten heart of Denver. We were not just shipping cardboard boxes of cheap plastic toys or household goods. OmniVantage was a multi-billion-dollar freight conglomerate specializing in transporting medical-grade chemicals, highly volatile biological materials, and hazardous waste across state lines. If a hospital needed liquid nitrogen, or a government research lab needed radioactive isotopes safely moved from coast to coast, we were the ones moving it. My official title within the company hierarchy was Route Compliance Director. If you looked at my email signature, it sounded incredibly prestigious, like I should be wearing a tailored blazer, making executive decisions, and attending high-stakes board meetings in glass-walled conference rooms. The reality of my daily life was violently different. My office was nothing more than a converted supply closet on the second basement level, squeezed between a rattling air conditioning unit and a massive server rack that hummed loud enough to vibrate my teeth. I spent my days drinking cold, bitter coffee out of a chipped mug, doing the grueling, invisible labor required to keep exactly 400 massive trucks from being impounded by the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration and the Environmental Protection Agency. At the absolute center of our entire corporate operation was a proprietary routing system the company called Sentinel. If you asked any executive on the top floor about it, they would smugly tell you that Sentinel was a state-of-the-art, fully automated software platform that magically cleared our hazardous materials through federal weigh stations and border checkpoints. They loved bragging about it to shareholders and investors during quarterly earnings calls. They genuinely believed it was just a piece of brilliant code doing all the heavy lifting, running on autopilot while they patted themselves on the back. They were completely and utterly wrong. Sentinel was not fully automated, not even close. The software was essentially a hollow shell, a fancy user interface with nothing inside. For it to legally function, it required the continuous, active authentication of a federally licensed senior operator every single morning, before a single ounce of toxic chemicals could legally roll onto an interstate highway. The system demanded a biometric identity certificate to validate the hazardous material manifests. That vital certificate did not belong to OmniVantage Logistics. It belonged solely to me. It was tied directly to my personal biometric data, my fingerprints, and my own social security number. Maintaining a federal hazardous routing license of that magnitude is brutally expensive and requires constant vigilance. Every single year, I had to submit expense reports to the company accounting department for exactly $25,000 under a line item vaguely labeled Training and Licensing. The finance team blindly approved it every single fiscal year. Assuming I was taking some mandatory corporate seminars, attending weekend workshops, or passing online multiple-choice quizzes to satisfy some basic human resources requirement. They never bothered to read the actual legal documentation attached to those invoices. If they had bothered to look closer, they would have realized that those $25,000 were not paying for fluffy corporate training. It was the exact cost of the federal renewal fees, the continuous Homeland Security background checks, and the biometric recertification required to keep my personal federal license active. Without my specific, heavily vetted legal clearance plugged into their network, the entire fleet would be legally grounded in a matter of minutes. But in the eyes of the executives upstairs, I was just a ghost haunting the basement. They took the smooth operation of the company entirely for granted. Nobody ever stopped to question why our highly dangerous freight always glided through federal way stations without a single delay or roadside inspection. Nobody wondered why we never caught a single regulatory fine while our biggest competitors bled millions of dollars in compliance penalties every single month. The upper management completely forgot I even existed, right up until the moment a massive snowstorm in the Midwest delayed a shipment by a few hours. Then, suddenly, I was the most important person in the building, dragged onto a loud conference call just so some angry vice president could scream at me and use me as a convenient scapegoat for the weather. I was the invisible gatekeeper holding up their entire golden empire. I was the only thing standing between OmniVantage logistics and total federal shutdown, and they were far too arrogant, too obsessed with their own corporate buzzwords and profit margins, to realize that the keys to their kingdom were sitting safely in my pocket. The catalyst for the apocalypse arrived in the form of a man named Trent. Trent was our newly minted Vice President of Human Resources, a walking cliché of middle management arrogance who practically sweated cheap cologne and toxic ambition. He had been poached from some failing tech startup, armed with a vocabulary consisting entirely of words like synergy, paradigm shifts, and lean optimization. Trent desperately needed to justify his massive new salary to the executive board, and he decided the fastest way to build his empire was to chop down someone else's department. He was a corporate bounty hunter looking for an easy kill to secure his annual bonus. And for reasons I will never fully comprehend, he painted a massive target squarely on my back. It started on a cold Tuesday morning. I received a sudden calendar notification marked as high priority. The subject line simply read, "Mandatory Budget Audit and Personnel Review." There was no agenda attached, no context provided, and the meeting was set to begin in exactly 10 minutes. When I took the elevator up from my basement bunker to the glass-walled executive suites on the top floor, I instantly recognized the setup. It was a classic corporate ambush. I pushed open the heavy glass door to find Trent sitting at the head of a massive mahogany conference table. To his right sat our chief financial officer, a man who usually avoided conflict but currently looked like a hostage forced to participate in a tribunal, to make matters even more absurd and theatrical. Trent had actually positioned two oversized men from the building security team near the exit. They stood with their arms crossed, trying their best to look intimidating. Trent was clearly attempting to isolate me, to corner me in a room where his authority felt absolute, and cast me as the ultimate sacrificial lamb for his new budget cleansing campaign. Trent did not offer me a seat. He did not even bother to say hello. Instead, he dramatically slammed a thick, aggressively color-coded folder onto the table. It landed with a loud thud that echoed off the glass walls. Bright red sticky notes jutted out from dozens of printed pages. "We are streamlining operations, Natalie," Trent began, leaning back in his expensive ergonomic chair and steepling his fingers like a cartoon villain. "And as part of my new fiscal optimization initiative, I have been thoroughly auditing legacy department budgets." Imagine my absolute shock when I uncovered a severe hemorrhage of company capital flowing directly into your personal pockets. I just stared at him, blinking in the harsh fluorescent light. "I have absolutely no idea what you are talking about, Trent." He let out a sharp, condescending laugh and flipped the folder open. "Do not play dumb with me. I am looking at your expense reports for the last 5 years. $25,000, year after year, filed under training and licensing. I cross-referenced these charges with our human resources database. We do not offer any internal programs that cost $25,000. I even called the vendors listed on these invoices. They are external federal credentialing agencies, not corporate trainers. Trent stood up, leaning heavily over the table to invade my space. His voice grew louder, dripping with manufactured righteous indignation meant to impress the chief financial officer. You have been systematically embezzling corporate funds to pay for your own private certifications. You are using our money to build up your own personal resume, taking useless luxury courses while contributing absolutely nothing of value to this organization. My information technology team assured me that the Sentinel routing software runs on a fully automated loop. It requires zero manual input. You sit down there in the dark, doing nothing, while draining our operational budget dry without my explicit human resources approval. I looked over at the chief financial officer. He refused to make eye contact with me, instead choosing to intensely study the grain of the mahogany table. Trent had completely convinced him that I was a high-level corporate parasite. "Trent," I said, keeping my voice entirely flat and devoid of emotion. "Those are not luxury courses. That money pays for the mandatory security clearances required to keep our freight moving across state lines. If you actually read the legal fine print instead of just staring at the dollar signs, you would understand that." "Do not try to lecture me on compliance," Trent snapped, his face flushing red with sudden anger. "Human resources never approved these exorbitant expenses. You circumvented my department entirely. This is gross financial misconduct, and I am putting a stop to it right here and right now. You are not going to steal another dime from this company to fund your little side projects." Most people would have panicked in that situation. Most people would have raised their voices, desperately tried to defend their livelihoods, or begged for their jobs. I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical sense of detachment. I slowly looked away from his furious red face and glanced down at the digital clock displayed in the corner of my work laptop screen. It read 11:40 in the morning. Trent had absolutely no idea how the federal security protocols actually functioned. He did not know that my biometric identification token was hardwired into the company servers with a rigorous deadman switch. Every single day, my federal license required me to manually input a randomly generated, encrypted personal identification number into the terminal at exactly 12 o'clock noon to maintain the active legal handshake with the government database. If I did not type in those specific numbers in exactly 20 minutes, the temporary daily authorization would instantly expire. The federal connection would sever. I did not need to argue with a fool who was busy tying his own noose. I just kept my eyes fixed on the digital clock, watching the seconds tick away, silently waiting for him to swing the axe. The silence in the boardroom was absolute, broken only by the faint hum of the climate control system pushing warm air through the vents above us. Trent leaned forward, placing both hands flat against the mahogany table to emphasize his absolute authority. "Effective immediately. Natalie, your employment with OmniVantage Logistics is terminated," he declared, his voice dripping with a rehearsed, clinical professionalism that barely masked his deep personal satisfaction. "We consider your gross misappropriation of corporate funds to be a fireable offense with cause. You are to hand over your company laptop right now. You are strictly forbidden from logging into any terminal, accessing any internal network, or communicating with any company personnel. Remove your employee identification badge and place it on the desk." He slid a thick stack of termination paperwork across the polished wood, pointing a manicured finger at the bottom line. He wanted a reaction. He was practically vibrating with the anticipation of a meltdown. Managers like Trent fed on the desperation of the people they crushed. He expected me to cry, to beg for a severance package, or to launch into a screaming fit of righteous anger that would justify the presence of the 2 large security guards standing by the door. I denied him that satisfaction. I felt an overwhelming wave of absolute tranquility wash over my entire body. My pulse did not elevate by a single beat. Without saying a word, I reached up and unclipped the blue lanyard from my neck. The plastic identification badge made a sharp, hollow click as I dropped it onto the glass surface of the table. I smoothly reached into my bag, retrieved my company laptop, and pushed it across the table toward him. I did not even bother to power it down. Then, I picked up the heavy brass pen he had provided. I did not scan the paragraphs of legal jargon, non-disclosure agreements, or the waiver of rights. None of it mattered anymore. I signed my name with slow, deliberate strokes, entirely sealing my sudden departure from the company. I stood up and smoothed the front of my coat. The two security guards immediately stepped forward, ready to physically grab me if I made a sudden move. I ignored them completely and locked my eyes directly onto Trent. His smug expression faltered for just a fraction of a second when he realized I was not completely broken. When my name automatically drops off the routing network at exactly 12 noon, you are going to have exactly 15 minutes before the Department of Homeland Security comes knocking on the front glass of this building, I said. My voice was eerily quiet, carrying no malice, only the cold, hard weight of an undeniable fact. Good luck, Trent. A terrible, arrogant smirk stretched across his face. He let out a soft snort of pure derision, shaking his head as if he were dealing with a delusional child. He fully believed it was just a pathetic, empty threat from a bitter, disgraced employee trying to salvage a tiny shred of dignity on her way out the door. He waved his hand dismissively toward the exit, signaling the guards to remove the garbage from his pristine executive suite. I turned my back on the Vice President of Human Resources and walked out of the boardroom. The security detail flanked me closely as we took the elevator down to the ground floor, marching me through the main lobby under the watchful eyes of the receptionists. I pushed through the heavy revolving doors and stepped out into the freezing Colorado winter. The brutal, biting wind of the Denver morning hit my face, but it felt incredibly refreshing. Snowflakes were gently drifting down onto the gray pavement of the massive employee parking lot. I walked to my car, my boots crunching softly against the fresh snow. Once I was sitting comfortably behind the steering wheel, I pulled my work-issued mobile phone from my coat pocket. I held down the power button until the screen went completely black, effectively severing my final digital tie to OmniVantage logistics. I tossed the dead piece of plastic into the passenger seat, turned the ignition, and blasted the heater. I did not drive home. Instead, I steered my car out of the corporate complex and headed straight down the interstate toward a familiar, run-down diner I frequented on the weekends. I slid into a faded red vinyl booth near the back window, ordered a greasy bacon and egg sandwich with a large mug of black coffee, and set my personal wristwatch face up on the sticky Formica table. It was 11:55 in the morning. The hourglass had officially flipped, and I sat in total peace, watching the sand drain away. Deep underground in the server room, the Sentinel mainframe awaited its daily heartbeat. At exactly 12 o'clock noon, the system sent an automated query, looking for my encrypted biometric handshake to validate the day's hazardous material manifests. The query pinged an empty void. The system automatically retried the connection once, then twice. At exactly 12:01, the master federal failsafe triggered. The comforting green authorization lights on the massive server rack snapped to a harsh, flashing crimson. The invisible guardian was officially gone, and the automated legal guillotine dropped. Cut to Interstate 80 outside Chicago. A massive 18-wheeler carrying 80 barrels of highly flammable industrial solvent was cruising down the highway at 65 miles per hour. At exactly 3 minutes past 12, the digital dashboard inside the truck cabin erupted into a blinding red strobe light. The GPS navigation screen instantly locked out, replaced by a massive, unyielding text block that read, "Federal ground stop. Pull over immediately. Do not proceed." This exact nightmare scenario played out simultaneously in 400 separate truck cabins, from the rainy highways of Seattle to the sun-baked asphalt of Texas. 400 massive steel bombs were suddenly stripped of their legal right to move, stranding confused drivers on the shoulders of major interstates all across the country. At a Department of Transportation way station on the Nevada border, a federal inspector was casually sipping a diet soda as an OmniVantage truck rolled onto the heavy scales. The inspector glanced at his monitor, fully expecting the usual green verification checkmark. Instead, the screen flashed a blaring, high-priority warning. the hazardous material routing code suddenly shifted from an active status to a critical federal alert labeled Invalid Credentials, No Responsible Party on File. The inspector slammed his hand down on the emergency lockdown button. Heavy steel barricades immediately dropped down across the exit lanes. Warning sirens began wailing across the facility. Armed state troopers stepped out of their cruisers, unbuttoning their holsters, signaling the deeply confused truck driver to cut the engine and step out of the vehicle with his hands visible. Back at the Denver headquarters, the main dispatch floor turned into a chaotic war zone within 10 minutes. Every single phone line lit up at the exact same time, creating a deafening symphony of ringing plastic. The director of client relations, a woman who usually handled minor scheduling hiccups, picked up her line only to have her eardrums blasted by the senior vice president of the largest pharmaceutical conglomerate in North America. Our tracking system shows 5 refrigerated trailers full of experimental vaccines are currently locked down by state police at the Canadian border. The executive screamed through the receiver. These shipments require continuous movement to maintain active cooling. We have millions of dollars of delicate biological assets sitting on the side of a highway, and your dispatchers are telling me they cannot override the system. Fix this right now, or I will personally sue your entire board of directors into bankruptcy. Up on the top floor, Trent was sitting peacefully in his office, admiring a freshly printed spreadsheet detailing the $25,000 he had just saved the company. He was completely oblivious to the sheer destruction ripping through the floors below him. He did not hear the sirens, the screaming dispatchers, or the ringing phones. The very first warning he received was the sound of his heavy office door violently slamming open against the wall. Vance, the chief executive officer of OmniVantage Logistics, stormed into the human resources suite looking like a man ready to commit physical violence. Vance did not bother with pleasantries. He marched directly over to the desk, grabbed the heavy, multi-line telephone, ripped it completely out of the wall jack, and violently smashed it into the floor, sending pieces of black plastic exploding across the carpet. Trent jumped out of his expensive ergonomic chair, his face instantly draining of all color. Cold sweat began beading on his forehead as he stared at the shattered phone. Do you want to explain to me why every single truck in our entire national fleet just went into a hard federal lockdown? Vance roared, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. Do you want to explain why my largest pharmaceutical client just threatened to annihilate this company in federal court? Do you want to explain why our publicly traded stock price just evaporated by 4% in the last 30 minutes? Trent stammered, his eyes darting frantically toward the shattered glass door as if looking for an escape route. Sir, I have no idea what you are talking about. I have been auditing the human resources budget all morning. The Department of Transportation just revoked our operating license across 40 different states, Vance screamed, slamming both of his fists down onto the desk, rattling Trent's coffee mug. The federal authorities are telling us that our senior compliance officer just fell off the grid, and our Sentinel system is running completely dark. Who the hell gave the order to touch the routing compliance team? Trent slowly looked down at the bright red spreadsheet resting on his desk. The document he thought would earn him a massive bonus suddenly looked like a signed confession to corporate sabotage. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The dominoes were falling faster than anyone could comprehend, and they were crushing everything in their path. The entire executive floor was in a state of absolute, unmitigated chaos. The chief executive officer had dragged the head of the information technology department, a nervous senior engineer named David, directly into the human resources suite. David was trembling, his fingers flying across the keyboard of a diagnostic laptop he had hastily plugged into the wall. He was desperately trying to peer into the back end of the Sentinel routing mainframe, completely surrounded by screaming executives who demanded an immediate technical miracle. Just reboot the damn servers, Vance bellowed, his voice echoing down the hallway. Bypass the authentication protocol. Write a patch. Do whatever it is you computer people do and get my fleet moving before we lose millions of dollars in spoiled freight. David wiped a thick layer of sweat from his forehead. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely type. I cannot just reboot it, sir. You do not understand how the architecture is built. This is not a glitch in the software. The system is functioning perfectly. It locked down because the primary security certificate was violently yanked out of the server array. The architecture requires a live biometric handshake. It needs a highly encrypted digital pulse tied directly to a licensed human operator. The authorized user profile was just deleted from the Active Directory. The system thinks we have been compromised. Trent was standing in the corner of the room, his expensive suit suddenly feeling very tight and suffocating. He watched his entire career dissolving right in front of his eyes. If he did not fix this immediately, Vance was not just going to fire him. Vance was going to make sure he never worked in the corporate sector again. A desperate, cornered animal will gnaw off its own leg to escape a trap, and Trent was right at that breaking point. His mind raced frantically, searching for any possible loophole in the corporate bureaucracy he loved so much. "Wait," Trent suddenly gasped, pushing his way toward the computer screen. When an employee signs a digital document, their signature is cached in the internal local network, right? We have her digital footprint stored on the backup drives. David looked up, his eyes wide with sheer terror. Yes, we retain encrypted logs of old login tokens for auditing purposes, but those are dead files. They are essentially digital ghosts. I do not care what you call them, Trent ordered, his voice cracking with sheer panic and misplaced authority. Pull up her last active digital signature from yesterday. I am officially ordering you, as the Vice President of Human Resources, to force that cached signature into the Sentinel validation field. Override the live biometric requirement. Just trick the system into thinking she is sitting at her desk so those trucks can turn their engines back on. The engineer stared at Trent as if the man had just asked him to detonate a bomb in the middle of the office. Sir, I absolutely cannot do that. Forcing a dead credential into a live federal database is a direct violation of every security protocol we have. I do not even know if the code will accept a hard-coded override, and if it does, it is highly illegal. Do it right now, or you are fired before you can blink, Trent screamed, spittle flying from his lips. He was completely blinded by his own survival instinct, entirely ignorant of the massive, catastrophic line he was about to cross. Under the direct threat of losing his livelihood, David swallowed hard, his hands trembling as he accessed the deep archival drives. He isolated my cached digital signature from the previous afternoon. With a few keystrokes, he bypassed the internal safety warnings, copied the encrypted string of data, and slammed it directly into the primary validation port of the Sentinel mainframe. For exactly 3 seconds, the horrific red warning screens across the dispatch floor blinked off. The system interface turned a bright, comforting green. A collective sigh of relief washed over the executive suite. Trent let out a shaky breath, a smug, arrogant smile slowly creeping back onto his pale face. He genuinely thought he had won. He thought he had outsmarted the system, beaten the rebel employee, and saved the company with his brilliant management skills. He was so deeply stupid, he had no idea what he had just unleashed. Trent did not understand that the federal network does not just check if a signature matches, it checks the living status of the person attached to that signature. When Sentinel sent that forged approval code out into the ether, it hit the Department of Homeland Security servers. The federal database instantly cross-referenced the signature with my social security number and my current employment status, which Trent had officially terminated and reported to the State Labor Board just 2 hours prior. The system saw a digital authorization to move highly explosive chemicals, biological waste, and radioactive materials being signed and approved by an employee who no longer legally worked for the company. In the eyes of the federal government, this was no longer a simple compliance failure. This was not a glitch. This was an active, deliberate forgery of federal transport documents for hazardous materials. Under the Patriot Act, attempting to hijack the routing system of explosive chemicals using stolen or forged credentials is automatically flagged as a potential act of domestic terrorism. The system did not just shut down the trucks this time, it triggered a Level 1 critical red flag, sending a silent, terrifying alarm directly to the highest levels of national security. The green lights on David's screen did not just turn red, the entire system crashed to black. A hard, unyielding lockout screen appeared, displaying the seal of the United States government. The keyboard went completely dead. Down on the ground floor, the peaceful snowy afternoon was violently shattered. At exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon, a convoy of unmarked black sport utility vehicles jumped the curb and skidded to a halt directly in front of the main glass doors of OmniVantage Logistics. The revolving doors were aggressively shoved open. More than a dozen federal agents wearing heavy tactical vests with Department of Homeland Security and Environmental Protection Agency emblazoned across their backs in bright yellow lettering swarmed into the lobby. They did not ask the receptionist for an appointment. They immediately secured all the exits and demanded complete control of the elevators. The lead agent, a tall man with a face like carved granite, flashed a gold badge and demanded the immediate physical lockdown of the entire server room. Upstairs, the chaotic noise in the executive suite died instantly when the building's security chief burst into the room, his face completely pale. "The federal authorities are downstairs," he stammered, barely able to catch his breath. "They are demanding to see the entire board of directors. They said they are preparing arrest warrants for the entire executive team." Vance slowly turned his head to look at Trent. The sheer magnitude of the disaster finally crashed down on the chief executive officer. He realized, in that sickening, silent moment, that his vice president of human resources had not just fired an essential worker to save a few pennies. Trent had just committed massive federal fraud. He had forcefully hijacked a national security database, forged a federal document, and effectively turned the entire leadership of a multi-billion-dollar logistics empire into suspected felons. The trap had violently snapped shut, and there was absolutely no way out. I was sitting peacefully in the diner, working on my second cup of black coffee and watching the snow fall outside the window. My personal mobile phone started vibrating on the sticky table. I glanced at the caller identification. It was a direct line from the Department of Homeland Security field office. I picked it up. It was Agent Miller, a senior inspector I had worked with closely during multiple routine compliance audits over the past 6 years. "Natalie," he said, his voice entirely devoid of small talk. "We have a critical situation at your headquarters. Someone just tried to force a dead biometric token to bypass a federal ground stop on hazardous materials. Are you currently at your terminal?" I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee, savoring the bitter taste. "Hello? Agent Miller. No, I am not at my terminal. I was formally terminated from my position at OmniVantage Logistics this morning. I signed the separation paperwork in the presence of the Human Resources Vice President at exactly 11:55. I have not been inside that building or on their secure network since then. Whatever digital authorization you are seeing on your end, it is a complete forgery." There was a heavy pause on the line. Agent Miller was a highly intelligent man. He instantly understood the terrifying legal implications of what I had just told him. "Understood, Natalie. Have a good afternoon." The line went dead. The federal hammer had just been fully authorized to strike. Less than 30 minutes later, my phone vibrated again. This time, the screen displayed the private cellular number of Chief Executive Officer Vance. I let it ring 4 times before I finally swiped the screen to answer. "Natalie." Vance gasped into the receiver. He sounded like a man who was actively having a heart attack. "Where are you?" "You need to come back to the building right this second. We have armed federal agents in our lobby. They are threatening to arrest the entire board of directors for domestic terrorism. I need you to explain the Sentinel Protocol to them right now. I will give you your job back instantly. I will double your salary. Just get back here." I smiled. It was a cold, genuine smile of absolute victory. "I am sorry, Vance, but I am not interested in returning to OmniVantage Logistics as an employee," I replied, keeping my voice smooth, polite, and perfectly level. "However, I have had a very productive 5 hours since your Human Resources Department escorted me off the premises. I spent my afternoon filing the expedited legal paperwork to form my own independent compliance consulting firm. It is a fully registered limited liability company. Since I am the only person in the state with the specific federal clearance level required to untangle the massive criminal mess your team is currently in, I am willing to take you on as my very first corporate client. Vance was hyperventilating. Fine, whatever you want. Just tell me your consulting fee. My emergency retainer fee is $5,000 per hour, I stated clearly. And given the extreme legal risk your executive team has generated, I require a guaranteed minimum contract of 6 months. That total amount must be paid entirely in advance, wired directly into my new business account before I even stand up from this diner booth. There was a choked gasp on the other end, followed by the sound of desperate, frantic breathing, but Vance had absolutely no leverage. He was staring down the barrel of a federal prison sentence. Done, Vance whispered, sounding completely defeated. I will have our legal department send the contract to your personal email right now. Please, just come back. There is one more non-negotiable clause, I added, my tone turning to absolute ice. While I am driving back, Trent is to handwrite his immediate resignation. He waives any right to a severance package, and he waives all unemployment benefits. I want his office packed into cardboard boxes, and I want him physically removed from the property without delay. If I see his face anywhere in that building when I arrive, our deal is off, and I will leave you to the federal agents. He is already gone, Vance snarled, his voice suddenly filled with pure hatred for the man who had caused this disaster. 10 minutes later, the digital contract arrived in my inbox. I signed it, finished my coffee, and drove back to the corporate campus. As I pulled into the freshly plowed parking lot, I saw Trent. He was shivering in the freezing wind, clutching a single cardboard box filled with desk toys, trudging through the heavy snow toward his car. He looked up and made eye contact with me as I drove past. He looked entirely broken. I did not even offer him a wave. I walked through the revolving glass doors of the lobby. The federal agents immediately recognized me and parted ways, allowing me to step up to the master server access terminal. I typed in my credentials, placed my thumb on the biometric scanner, and brought the multi-billion-dollar empire back from the dead. I was no longer the invisible gatekeeper in the basement. I was the absolute savior of the company, and I had left a totally ruined human resources department in my wake. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. I truly appreciate your time and your continued support. Please let me know in the comments below where you are listening from today. If you found today's story satisfying and you want to help keep this channel alive, please consider joining the Boss Revenge Stories Patreon. There, you can listen to our absolute best, most exclusive true revenge stories that we simply cannot make public on YouTube. You can join right now by scanning the QR code on your screen or by clicking the Patreon link in the description or the pinned comment. Have a wonderful day, and I will see you in the next one.